I used to think the most dangerous soldiers in the Vietnam War were American Special Forces. Then I learned about the Australians, 5 men in tattered bush hats who moved through the jungle like smoke through morning mist. No radio chatter, no visible equipment, just silence and death following in their wake. The North Vietnamese Army had a name for them, Ma Rung, Phantoms of the Jungle. And there was good reason for that name, because between 1966 and 1971, these ghosts would conduct nearly 1,200 patrols deep into enemy territory, kill over 500 enemy combatants, and lose only 2 men to enemy action, the highest kill ratio of any unit in the entire war. This is the story of how a small contingent of Australian Special Air Service soldiers became the most feared enemy the Viet Cong and North Vietnamese Army would ever face. The Australian Special Air Service Regiment didn't arrive in Vietnam as strangers to jungle warfare. Their baptism by fire had come 1 year earlier, in a conflict most people have never heard of. The Indonesian Confrontation, Borneo, 1965, where the border between Malaysian Sarawak and Indonesian Kalimantan ran through some of the most hostile terrain on Earth. Mountains covered in triple canopy jungle, rivers that could swallow a man whole, villages tucked into valleys so remote that some inhabitants had never seen outsiders before. It was here, in this green hell, that the Australian SAS learned what would make them legendary. The confrontation was Indonesia's attempt to destabilize the newly formed Malaysian Federation through armed infiltration and subversion. President Sukarno's forces crossed the border regularly, moving through the jungle to attack Malaysian positions and incite rebellion. The British Commonwealth response was Operation Claret, secret cross-border raids into Indonesian territory, missions that officially never happened, operations that would be denied if discovered. And the Australians threw themselves into this shadowy war with an intensity that surprised even the British SAS, who had trained them. First Squadron arrived in Borneo in February 1965. They were given a simple mission: reconnaissance patrols along the border, hearts and minds operations with indigenous tribes, gathering intelligence on Indonesian infiltration routes. Standard stuff. Except the Australians didn't approach it as standard. They approached it as if their lives depended on perfection, because in that jungle they did. The British had been operating in Borneo for months already. They had established protocols, rules of engagement, standard operating procedures. The Australians studied every patrol report the British had filed. They debriefed every soldier who had operated in that environment. They absorbed every lesson that had been paid for in blood and sweat. And then they took those lessons and refined them, made them sharper, quieter, more lethal. In May 1965, First Squadron began their first Claret operations, cross-border patrols up to 20,000 yards into Indonesian territory. Deeper than infantry units were permitted to go. These weren't raids in the traditional sense. The Australians weren't kicking down doors or storming positions. They were inserting silently, moving through terrain that would break most men, observing Indonesian camps from meters away, recording troop movements, mapping supply routes, and when the opportunity presented itself, setting ambushes that left the Indonesians wondering if they were fighting humans or spirits. The jungle of Borneo taught the SAS things that couldn't be learned anywhere else. It taught them that speed was sometimes your enemy, that patience could be a weapon as deadly as any rifle, that the jungle itself would tell you everything you needed to know if you learned to listen. the way vines hung after someone brushed past them, the direction birds flew when startled, the smell of cooking fires carried on the breeze, the almost imperceptible paths worn by repeated footsteps. Every element of that environment became part of their operational vocabulary. They learned to move in 4- and 5-man patrols, small enough to go undetected, large enough to fight their way out if compromised, lead scout, patrol commander, second in command, signaller, medic, each man with a specific role, each man capable of assuming any other role if needed. They rehearsed until coordination became instinct, until they could communicate with nothing more than a glance or the angle of a rifle barrel. The Australians also learned something else in Borneo, something that would define their operations in Vietnam. They learned that sometimes the best weapon was invisibility itself. During one patrol, an SAS soldier spent 3 days concealed in dense undergrowth while Indonesian troops moved past his position repeatedly. He never moved, never made a sound, barely breathed. When it was finally safe to extract, he had recorded detailed intelligence on enemy strength, equipment, and routines, all without firing a single shot. This philosophy of reconnaissance over engagement became doctrine. The Australians understood that every bullet fired was a compromise of position. Every explosion was an invitation for the enemy to converge. The objective wasn't to rack up body counts. It was to see without being seen, to move without being detected, to operate so effectively that the enemy never knew they'd been there until it was too late. By the time 2nd Squadron rotated through Borneo in early 1966, the techniques had been refined into an art form. Patrols that lasted weeks, insertions by helicopter at treetop level into clearings barely large enough for the skids to touch down, extractions under fire when compromised, living in the jungle with minimal supplies, eating cold rations because cooking fires gave away position, sleeping in shifts, always watching, always listening, always ready. 3 Australian SAS soldiers died in Borneo. One was killed in a tragic accident involving an elephant. The other 2 likely drowned crossing a swollen river during an extraction. Not one was killed in direct combat with Indonesian forces, and yet they killed over 20 Indonesian soldiers in ambushes and contacts. They proved that superior fieldcraft and discipline could overcome numerical disadvantages. That knowledge would travel with them to Vietnam. When 3rd Squadron deployed to Vietnam in April 1966, they arrived at Nui Dat as part of the 1st Australian Task Force. Their mission was identical to what it had been in Borneo: be the eyes and ears, conduct long-range reconnaissance patrols, gather intelligence on Viet Cong and North Vietnamese Army movements. But Vietnam was different. The enemy was more numerous, better equipped, more experienced. The jungle was just as hostile, but the operational tempo was higher, and the Australians would have to prove themselves all over again. They wasted no time doing exactly that. The standard Australian SAS patrol in Vietnam consisted of 5 men. Sometimes 4, sometimes 6, depending on the mission. But 5 was the sweet spot. The patrol commander led the team, usually a sergeant or lieutenant with experience and judgment honed by months or years of jungle operations. The second in command was typically a corporal who could assume leadership if the commander was hit. The lead scout moved ahead of the patrol, reading the terrain, spotting danger before it spotted them. The signaller carried the radio and managed communications with base. The medic carried medical supplies and cross-trained in various weapon systems. These weren't soldiers playing at being special operators. They were men who had been selected through one of the most brutal training regimens in any military. The Australian SAS selection course was modeled on the British version, but adapted for Australian conditions. Candidates were pushed to physical and psychological limits. Navigation tests across hundreds of kilometers of wilderness, load-bearing marches that broke bodies and minds, interrogation resistance training, jungle survival courses, weapons proficiency standards that demanded perfection. Most who attempted selection failed. Those who passed emerged as something different, harder, quieter, more confident in their capabilities. The Australians operated throughout Phuoc Tuy province primarily, though they ranged into Bien Hoa, Long Khan, and Binh Tuy provinces as well. Their area of operations covered some of the most contested real estate in South Vietnam, the Mae Tao Mountains, the Long High Hills, the Ho Bo and Rung Sat zones, dense jungle punctuated by rice paddies, and villages where the Viet Cong moved with impunity, where North Vietnamese Army regulars established base camps and supply depots beyond the range of Australian artillery, where intelligence was scarce and contact with the enemy was always a heartbeat away. The Australians, inserted by helicopter most often, worked closely with 9th Squadron Royal Australian Air Force, who flew Iroquois helicopters with skill and courage that saved countless SAS lives. The insertions were carefully choreographed. Multiple helicopters would fly patterns across the operational area. Some would touch down. Others would hover without landing. The goal was to confuse enemy observers about where patrols had actually been inserted. Sometimes a patrol would touch down, move a short distance, then be extracted and inserted again at a different location. Anything to obscure the pattern. Anything to maintain operational security. Once on the ground, the Australians moved differently than other units. American patrols typically covered ground quickly. They had objectives to reach and timelines to meet. Australian SAS patrols moved with excruciating slowness. A day's movement for an American unit might take an Australian patrol 3 or 4 days. They would advance a few hundred meters, then stop and observe, listen, watch, let the jungle settle around them. They understood that speed compromised stealth, that rushing created noise, that the enemy was hunting for exactly the kind of sounds and disturbances that came from troops moving too quickly through dense terrain. Their gear reflected this philosophy. While American units carried heavy loads, the Australians stripped weight ruthlessly. They modified their weapons extensively. The standard L1A1 self-loading rifle issued to Australian infantry was a reliable 7.62 mm weapon, but it was heavy and long, unwieldy in dense jungle. So the SAS armorer would modify the rifles, shorten the barrel to just past the gas block, remove the wooden furniture, add foregrips from other weapons, convert the semi-automatic mechanism to full automatic, fit 30 round magazines instead of the standard 20. These modified weapons earned a nickname among the troops, the bitch, because when you fired them on full automatic, the shortened barrel and light weight made them nearly impossible to control. The muzzle would climb, the weapon would twist, and it would spit an enormous ball of flame from the shortened barrel. That flame and the thunderous report served a tactical purpose. When an SAS patrol was compromised and had to fight, they would unleash devastating volleys of fire. The bitch made it sound like heavy machine guns, multiple weapon systems, a much larger force than 5 men. Viet Cong and NVA soldiers hearing that sound and seeing that muzzle flash would often break contact immediately, convinced they had stumbled into a larger Australian position. The Australians also carried M16s with XM-148 grenade launchers, M60 machine guns that had been cut down to reduce weight, Claymore mines, M26 grenades, British Sterling submachine guns with suppressors for silent kills. Whatever the mission required, they were pragmatic about equipment. If something didn't serve a purpose, it was left behind. Every ounce of weight was scrutinized, because in that environment, the difference between life and death could come down to whether you could move silently for one more hour, whether you had one more magazine, whether your gear snagged on vegetation at the wrong moment. The operational pattern was refined over hundreds of patrols, insertion at dawn or dusk when the light played tricks, immediate movement away from the landing zone to avoid being tracked, establishment of a hide position where the patrol would observe and listen for signs of enemy awareness, then slow, methodical movement toward the objective. Could be a suspected Viet Cong base camp, could be a trail junction, could be a river crossing, whatever intelligence had identified as important. When they reached their objective, the Australians would establish observation positions so close to enemy positions that they could read markings on equipment, count the notches on rifle stocks, identify officers by their behavior and equipment, note supply routes, record the times of enemy movements. One patrol spent 48 hours concealed within 50 meters of a North Vietnamese Army radio relay station, so close they could hear conversations. They observed shifts changes, supply deliveries, security patrols, and when they extracted, they brought back intelligence that allowed artillery and airstrikes to destroy the position completely. The Viet Cong and NVA learned to fear the Australians in a way they didn't fear most other units. There were stories that circulated among communist forces about whole patrols that disappeared without trace, about sentries who were found with their throats cut, no alarm raised, no sound made, about supply convoys that were ambushed with such precision that every vehicle was destroyed before anyone could return fire. The communist forces gave the Australians that name, Ma Rung, phantoms of the jungle. It was said half in fear, half in grudging respect. One former Viet Cong soldier interviewed decades after the war remembered the Australian SAS with clarity that time hadn't dimmed. "We were not afraid of the American GIs or even B-52 bombing," she said. "We hated the Australian SAS Rangers because they make comrades disappear." That statement captures something essential about how the Australians operated. They didn't just kill enemy soldiers. They created an atmosphere of dread, a psychological weight that affected morale and decision-making. During peak enemy activity periods, which the Australians called Pak time, from 1100 to 1500 hours, patrols would go completely static. They would establish hide positions in dense vegetation, sometimes concealing themselves under rotted logs, sometimes burrowing into mud banks, sometimes climbing into tree canopies, and they would watch, silent, motionless, recording everything that moved past them: Viet Cong supply runners, NVA patrols, local villagers who might be sympathizers. Everything was noted, everything was reported. After pot time ended, the patrol would conduct what they called sensory reconnaissance. Each man would move a short distance from the central position, fanning out to form an extended perimeter. They would use all their senses, listen for sounds carried on the evening breeze, smell for cooking fires or tobacco smoke, watch for movement in the fading light. Then they would return to the patrol position and establish their harbor site for the night, a defensive position where they could rest in shifts, ready to fight if discovered, ready to extract if compromised. The Australians also pioneered techniques that American units later adopted. They worked extensively with Ma Rung, the highly classified studies and observations group that conducted cross-border operations into Laos and Cambodia. Australian SAS personnel taught courses at the MERCV Recondo School, starting in September 1966. They shared their jungle fieldcraft, their patrol techniques, their insertion and extraction procedures. The bond between Australian SAS and American Special Operations units grew strong, built on mutual respect and shared hardship. Some Australian SAS soldiers served on exchange with American units. Others worked directly with Ma Rung on operations that remain classified even today. They also operated alongside New Zealand SAS troops. Each Australian squadron had a New Zealand troop attached, typically about 15 men. The New Zealanders brought their own expertise and traditions. Together, they formed a combined ANZAC special operations capability that was greater than the sum of its parts. The Australian approach to reconnaissance emphasized patience in a way that frustrated some American commanders. An American patrol might be tasked with checking a grid square for enemy activity, which they would do by moving through the area and reporting what they found. An Australian patrol, given the same task, would establish observation posts and sit in place for days, watching patterns, noting changes, building a complete picture of enemy activity rather than a snapshot. This took more time, but produced higher quality intelligence. When the situation demanded offensive action, the Australians could strike with shocking violence. Ambushes were planned meticulously, every field of fire calculated, every withdrawal route rehearsed, claymore mines positioned to channel enemy movement into kill zones, weapons sighted on likely enemy positions, and then they would wait. Hours, sometimes days, until the enemy walked into the killing ground. When the ambush was triggered, the Australians would unleash coordinated fire that lasted seconds but felt like minutes to those caught in it. Then they would withdraw immediately, not staying to count bodies, not searching for souvenirs, just vanishing back into the jungle before enemy reinforcements could arrive. This hit-and-run approach maximized enemy casualties while minimizing their own exposure. The statistics tell part of the story. Between 1966 and 1971, Australian and New Zealand SAS troops in Vietnam conducted nearly 1,200 patrols. They confirmed killing 492 enemy combatants, listed another 106 as possibly killed, wounded 47, listed 10 as possibly wounded, captured 11 prisoners. These numbers don't include enemy killed by artillery or airstrikes that SAS patrols directed. When those are added, the total climbs significantly higher. And all of this was accomplished while suffering minimal casualties themselves. 1 killed in action, 1 died of wounds, 3 killed in accidents, 1 missing in action, 28 wounded. The kill ratio was unprecedented. No other unit in Vietnam, American or Allied, achieved anything close to those numbers. The closest comparable units were Navy SEAL teams and Ma Rung reconnaissance teams. Both operated similarly to the Australian SAS. Both achieved impressive results, but neither sustained operations at that level of effectiveness for as long as the Australians did. Part of what made the Australian SAS so effective was their selection of targets. They didn't go hunting for contact. They weren't racking up body counts for their own sake. Every patrol had specific intelligence objectives: confirm or deny enemy presence in an area, identify supply routes, locate base camps, gather order of battle information. If a target of opportunity presented itself during these patrols, they would exploit it. But they never compromised their primary mission for the sake of engagement. This discipline saved lives, both Australian and enemy. Because a patrol that gets into an unnecessary firefight is a patrol that might not make it home, the Australians understood that their value wasn't measured in enemy bodies. It was measured in intelligence provided, in enemy movements disrupted, in the psychological impact of operating with such effectiveness that the enemy changed behavior to avoid them. The terrain itself was an adversary unlike anything most soldiers had experienced. The jungles of Phuoc Tuy province weren't the manicured forests of training areas. They were chaotic tangles of vegetation where visibility dropped to meters, where every step had to be placed carefully to avoid snapping branches or rustling leaves, where thorns and wait-a-minute vines grabbed at clothing and equipment, where snakes and insects presented constant hazards, where the heat and humidity drained strength even from hardened soldiers. During the monsoon season, rain transformed the jungle into a swamp. Streams became rivers. Rivers became torrents. The ground turned to mud that sucked at boots and threatened to pull men under. Leeches infested every water source. Mosquitoes carried malaria and dengue fever. Fungal infections ate at skin that never fully dried. Operating in those conditions required mental toughness that went beyond physical endurance. Yet the Australians thrived in that environment. Or perhaps thrived isn't the right word. They endured it, mastered it, turned it into an ally. They learned which plants could be eaten in emergencies, which water sources were safer than others, how to treat wounds with limited medical supplies, how to keep weapons functional despite constant exposure to moisture and mud. These weren't skills taught in training. They were lessons learned through experience and shared across squadrons as rotations occurred. The 3 squadrons rotated through Vietnam on roughly year-long deployments. 3rd Squadron from April 1966 to March 1967. 1st Squadron from March 1967 to February 1968. 2nd Squadron from March 1968 to February 1969. Then the rotations repeated. 3rd Squadron returned for a second tour, then 1st Squadron, then 2nd Squadron for a final deployment that ended in October 1971, when Australian forces began their withdrawal from Vietnam. Each rotation built on the lessons of previous tours. Patrol reports were studied obsessively. After-action reviews identified what worked and what didn't. Techniques were refined. Equipment was modified. The institutional knowledge grew deeper with each passing month. By 1969, when the enemy had largely withdrawn from Phuoc Tuy province into border sanctuaries, the Australian SAS adapted their operations. They began conducting longer-range patrols into Long Con province and along the borders with Cambodia. The distances increased, the time in the field lengthened, but the mission remained the same: find the enemy, report their locations and intentions, strike when the opportunity was right. The relationship between Australian SAS and the helicopter crews who supported them deserves special mention. 9th Squadron RIAF flew missions that required extraordinary skill and courage, inserting patrols into tiny jungle clearings at treetop level, extracting compromised patrols under fire, conducting resupply missions that involved hovering while crew chiefs kicked out bundles. These pilots and crew chiefs earned the trust of SAS soldiers through repeated demonstrations of competence under pressure. When a patrol called for extraction, they came, no matter the weather, no matter the enemy situation. That reliability was priceless. There were moments of extraordinary bravery, moments that defined what it meant to be SAS, a patrol compromised by overwhelming enemy forces, fighting their way to an extraction point while under sustained fire. A wounded soldier carried for kilometers through hostile territory by teammates who refused to leave him behind. a signaler calling in artillery danger close, rounds landing meters from their position to break up an enemy assault. These weren't Hollywood heroics. They were desperate acts by men who understood that survival depended on each other. The Australians also worked to build relationships with local populations when possible. Hearts and minds operations weren't their primary mission, but they understood the value of human intelligence. A friendly villager might report Viet Cong movements. A local guide might reveal hidden trails. Medical aid provided to sick children could turn a neutral village into a source of information. The SAS carried medical supplies and would treat injuries when they encountered civilians. It was pragmatic. It was also the right thing to do. As the war progressed and American forces began drawing down, the operational tempo for Australian SAS increased. With fewer American units in the field, the intelligence burden shifted. Australian patrols ranged further and stayed out longer. By 1970, some patrols were spending 3 weeks in the field, living on cold rations, sleeping in mud, moving like ghosts through enemy-controlled territory. The physical and psychological toll was immense, but the quality of intelligence never wavered. The last Australian SAS patrol in Vietnam was conducted in September 1971. 2nd Squadron extracted and returned to Australia in October. They left behind a legacy that would influence special operations doctrine for decades. The techniques they pioneered in Borneo and refined in Vietnam became the template for small unit reconnaissance operations. The emphasis on stealth over speed, the focus on intelligence over engagement, the integration of indigenous knowledge and terrain mastery into operational planning. These weren't revolutionary concepts, but the Australians executed them with a level of discipline and effectiveness that set the standard. In total, 580 men served in the Australian SAS during the Vietnam War. Not all were in Vietnam at the same time. The squadron strength varied, but typically numbered around 110 to 130 men, including support personnel. The combat patrols themselves were the tip of the spear. Behind them was an entire infrastructure of intelligence analysts, logistics specialists, communications technicians, medical personnel, and administrative staff who made operations possible. The soldiers who served in those patrols came from across Australia. Farm boys from Queensland, surfers from New South Wales, city kids from Melbourne, miners from Western Australia. They came from different backgrounds, but selection and training forged them into something unified, something exceptional. They developed a culture that prized understatement and competence over bragging and bravado. Success was expected. Failure was examined clinically to prevent repetition. The mission always came first. The psychological impact on individual soldiers was significant. Operating for extended periods in small teams under constant stress leaves marks that time doesn't always heal. Some adjusted well after returning home. Others struggled with the transition back to normal life. The intense bonds formed in combat don't translate easily to civilian relationships. The heightened awareness necessary for survival in the jungle can become exhausting hypervigilance in peaceful settings. Many SAS veterans found that the people they could truly talk to were other SAS veterans who understood the weight of those experiences. The Australian SAS in Vietnam represented something rare in military history, a small unit that achieved outsized impact through superior training, discipline, and technique. They proved that numbers aren't everything, that technology has limits, that human factors like courage, competence, and cohesion can overcome significant disadvantages. They showed that the key to reconnaissance wasn't just seeing the enemy. It was seeing the enemy without being seen, understanding their patterns, predicting their movements, and, when necessary, striking with precision and withdrawing before the enemy could respond. The name Ma Rung, Phantoms of the Jungle, wasn't given lightly. It was earned through hundreds of patrols where enemy soldiers looked for them and found nothing, through ambushes that struck without warning and vanished without trace, through a level of operational security so complete that even decades later, many specific operations remain classified. The Viet Cong and North Vietnamese Army were formidable opponents, hardened by years of war, experienced in jungle warfare, supplied and supported by sophisticated logistics networks. They weren't easily frightened, but they feared the Australian SAS, and with good reason. When Australian forces withdrew from Vietnam in 1971, they left behind a country that would fall to communist forces 4 years later. The strategic failure of the war doesn't diminish the tactical achievements of the men who fought there. The Australian SAS did everything asked of them and more. They provided intelligence that shaped operations across multiple provinces. They disrupted enemy logistics and movements. They killed enemy combatants at a ratio unmatched by any other unit, and they brought most of their soldiers home alive. The legacy of the Australian SAS in Vietnam extends beyond the war itself. Their techniques and procedures influence the development of special operations forces worldwide. American, British, and New Zealand units studied Australian patrol reports and adopted their methods. The emphasis on patient reconnaissance became doctrine. The integration of modified equipment, tailored to specific operational environments, became standard practice. The focus on small, highly trained teams operating independently in hostile territory became the model for modern special operations. Today, the Australian Special Air Service Regiment continues to serve as one of the premier special operations units in the world. They have deployed to East Timor, Iraq, Afghanistan, and numerous other conflicts. Each generation of SAS soldiers learns the history of those who came before. They study the patrol reports from Vietnam. They honor the traditions established in Borneo and refined in the jungles of Phuoc Tuy Province, because those traditions work, because those techniques save lives, because the lessons paid for in sweat and blood in the 1960s remain relevant today. The 5 men in tattered bush hats who moved through the Vietnamese jungle like smoke, who struck without warning and vanished without trace, who earned the name Ma Rung through competence and courage. They were Australia's sons, and they became Vietnam's nightmare, not through overwhelming force, not through advanced technology, but through mastery of their craft, through discipline, through an unwavering commitment to excellence. They were phantoms, they were ghosts, they were the Australian SAS, and the enemy was right to fear them.